Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, before we start looking at the ongoing war that is taking place, I wanted to try to obtain a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of intel in regards to a certain content provider. So why is this specific content provider, why does it have the attention of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network? Well, I believe what has happened in regards to this content provider gives us insight into what is happening inside of Ukraine. So, obviously, here in the West, it's difficult to obtain information about the ongoing war. You have the mainstream news media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, that give very little information about what is happening on the battlefield. So, persons interested in trying to obtain information are turning to content providers. One specific content provider, this guy Davidov. As you can see here, he's got his Ukrainian paraphernalia on, and he is a avid supporter of the Ukrainian state in its efforts to dislodge Russian forces from Ukraine. Now, at the start of the conflict, Mr. Davidov was located inside of Ukraine. And he has since fled Ukraine. He has fled to, we believe, it is Switzerland. Although we do hear he is vacationing currently in France, while again making these videos about what is happening on the ground. So the question is why? Why did Mr. Davidov flee Ukraine? Why did he get out? Because that's what happened. He departed. Now some say it's because of obviously he has a prospering channel that is reporting on the conflict. In any one day he can get 600, 500,000 views on one of his videos. But again, why did he leave? Was it because he didn't have internet access? Was it because he felt that he was going to be bombed? Now, we know that's not the case. We know he could establish internet connectivity in Ukraine. Now, there was a period in time where that had been difficult, but there are ways to create content inside of Ukraine. Safety. Was it safety? Was it the threat of a bomb dropping on his house? Well, look. The facts are this. You are more at risk here in the United States of being struck by a person driving while intoxicated and killed in a car accident than you are as a civilian, a non-combatant being killed in Ukraine. Civilian casualties, surprisingly enough, are very low in this conflict. Now, there have been cases where a large amount of civilians have been killed in an errant weapon strike, and that goes for both sides. We have seen supporters in Novorossiya being killed, civilians, and we have seen the same happening in Ukraine. But again, the risk is for the most part fairly low. So if you remove those two reasons for fleeing your country while you perceive it is under attack, what's the reason? Well, Could it be that Mr. Davidov does not want to be conscripted into Ukraine's armed forces? He is a pilot. He has advanced skill sets. He could operate a drone. He could teach others how to fly aircraft, drones, what have you. There is opportunity for him to serve his nation, but he has chose to leave his nation and flee to another country to make YouTube videos. Can Mr. Davidov return to Ukraine? Would he be allowed back to Ukraine? We don't know. We can't answer that question. Does the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior have an arrest warrant issued for Mr. Davidov because he fled the country? We do know he departed Ukraine through, let's just say, through not the normal channels when one leaves one's country. Was he smuggled out? Did something like that occur? Possibly. We're not going to delve into that too much. But again, if you have information on that, we'd love to know. We'd love to gain an understanding. And again, it has to do with the conflict. Why did this man decide to leave Ukraine? What were the reasons? What caused it? Something was happening. Obviously, there's a war going on, and obviously he doesn't want to be drafted into the military. And we're erring on that route. That is the reason he did not want to stay. He did not want to be conscripted into the armed forces. So very interesting to see that. And again, would Ukraine allow him back into the country? And would he even want to return to Ukraine? There is some information out there that he tried to seek asylum in the United States and was denied for various reasons. And again, I'm not going to get into that either because I can't verify those reasons. And that just wouldn't be prudent. It would not be reasonable. But again, we have heard that. We have heard he has tried to come to the United States. But again, just it is one of these issues that are happening right now in which you have a war on and you flee your country to then talk about that conflict. And maybe that rubs me the wrong way. His reporting, I would say it's not over the top. It's obviously definitely supportive of the Ukrainian state. And he errs on that support. All right, so let's get into the ongoing war. We are continuing to see heavy fighting south of Orikhiv in the Robotynya pocket. Again, we have seen the Ukrainian forces essentially fail in its operation just to the outskirts of Verbova. So now it appears the Ukrainians are now attempting to advance on Novopokrovka in this area. And again, due south. It appears the Russians are wanting the Ukrainians to penetrate deeper into the southern sector of the salient. And again, we believe that is to entrap Ukrainian forces in this pocket. But again, the advance towards Verbova stalled, and the Ukrainian forces have now started keying on Novopokrovka. And again, I know I'm butchering that, and I apologize, but it's the best one can do. So we're continuing to watch what is happening in this area very closely. The Russians continue to bombard Ukrainian forces in this area. Now, there appears to be growing friction between the U.S. Pentagon and the Ukrainian High Command. The U.S. Pentagon believes that in about 30 to 40 days, the ability for the Ukrainians to continue counterattacks are going to start to wane because the weather is going to change. Well, what is that going to do? How is the weather going to impact this conflict? Let's go over to the Rondelli Foundation map. This will give us a better ability to discuss what weather could do. So there is a high water table in Ukraine. This is what makes the ground, the land, very fertile. There are lots of farms. Now, when it starts to get colder and it starts to change in weather, it starts to rain. And it starts to snow. And it starts to get colder. For one issue, the foliage ends. All these trees become bare. Now, does that help the Russians or does it help the Ukrainians? Well, I would say that it would help the Russians more. And here's the reason. The Russians can try to conceal some of their military hardware, especially long-range artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, in these areas where there is foliage. The unfortunate thing for the Russians is the United States is very active in this conflict. They are using, the United States, is using its technology to search for Russian weapon systems in these areas. So even because there is foliage, that does not mean the United States does not have the ability to identify tanks, armored vehicles, heavy artillery that is trying to camouflage itself. And what we're referring to is the ability to sense and shoot. And Ukraine does have that ability. Okay? The United States is providing real-time satellite through both optics and, more importantly, radar. Radar can see into these forest lines that skirt all these farmlands. And then once those coordinates are identified, yes, the Ukrainians then have the ability to launch these HIMARS systems and other systems as well that have been provided by other nation states such as Turkey. And the Ukrainians have developed some of their own systems as well. Now, do the Russians have that same capability? Yes and no. The Russians do have the ability to see targets that are hidden in tree lines. Now, is that technology as advanced as the United States? It is not. Now, a secondary point is going to be the rain and the mucking up of these fields, such as what we'll focus here on Verbova. Okay? So these fields are going to become very inundated with water. They're going to become muddy. And any operation not on these roads, and again, the Russians faced this in the early days of the conflict when they departed from these roadways, they got stuck. Yes, tanks can get stuck. I was a tanker and I have been stuck multiple times. and you get another tank to unstuck you, is basically what happens. And yes, sometimes you risk then getting that tank stuck as well. And then again, wheeled vehicles. The Ukrainians use a lot of MRAPs now that have been donated to the Ukrainians from the United States and other European powers. Wheeled vehicles, especially in these areas that once they become highly inundated with water, they become mud, and even those vehicles, those wheeled vehicles, are going to be at risk of getting stuck in the mud. It happened to the Germans during World War II. I mean, it happened to the Russians in World War II. It just does not make for very good maneuver warfare. And especially if the Ukrainians, and we know the Ukrainians are using a lot of MRAPs, a lot of four-wheel drive vehicles and other vehicles that use tires. Off-roading then becomes very difficult as this weather changes. And then again, adding in the minefields, adding in the use of long-range artillery, use of drones, it just becomes much more difficult to fight in winter than it does in the summer. Another issue is in the winter you have more contrast with your thermal imaging sites. And that could help both parties involved. The Russians have thermal imaging cameras. The Ukrainians have thermal imaging cameras. Do the Ukrainians have better thermal imaging optics? I would say, yeah, that's a reasonable assessment. That does not mean the Russians don't have thermal imaging capability. They do. They absolutely do. And it's probably not as bad as many people think it is. You hear that a lot, that the Russians don't have, they don't have the ability to fight at night. Their thermal imaging cameras aren't as good. Now, there's partial truth to that, but it's not entirely true. The Russians do have thermal imaging sites, and they use them. And again, as it gets colder, and especially if the Ukrainians start to use M1A2s or M1A1s in the middle of winter against the Russians are going to see those M1A1s, especially if they have airborne thermal imaging optics in those attack helicopters the Russians are going to field or are fielding. Why is that? Well, the M1A1, the M1A2, let's call it the M1 Abrams, uses a turbine engine. The exhaust from that turbine engine is over 1,000 degrees. It is incredibly hot. You could take a cup of coffee in a very short period of time. You could heat your coffee up and have boiling water. Another issue is on the left side of the M1 Abrams is the exhaust for the internal heater. It's a little round circle. If you look to the left side of the M1 tank along the hull, you'll see it. It's just a little round hole. And us tankers, we would also use that instead of having to start your turbine. You could run the heater off the batteries for a period of time. That is also going to generate a lot of heat. And if it's very cold out, and those Ukrainian tankers want to get warm or heat up a cup of coffee, the Russians are going to see them. It's going to light that vehicle up. Again, the contrast, the cold environment versus the heat of the tank is going to make the Abrams stand out very apparent. But again, we believe at this point there is not going to be much more advance by the Ukrainians in this area, in the Robotynya pocket. Now, there has been a report that there was a series of engagements just south of Avdiivka near the town of Optinya. And the reports that are circulating is that a Russian military unit, a company-sized element, attempted to pull out of this area and was moving towards the Donetsk airport, which is no longer an airport. It's no longer being used as an airport. So essentially it's just an open field. That there was a friendly fire incident in which Russian artillery attacked a retreating Russian company-sized element that was operating in this area. Now, we have heard that. That is making its rounds on media as we speak. And again, if we get more information on that, we'll certainly report it. Casualties are on the level of a company-sized element being engaged with heavy artillery. 40, 50, 60 casualties. Both KIA and wounded. So we'll continue to try to get information on that. We do not think this is a concerted effort by Ukrainian forces to push south of Avdiivka into Donetsk city itself. We don't think that capability exists. We have also seen Russian counterattacks taking place on the northwest quadrant of Bakhmut, this area. So again, the Russians continue to launch limited offensive operations in these areas. Well, but again, we think at this point the Russians are solidifying its territory that it has taken. It is building multiple layers of defensive lines to hold on to that territory as the Russian military expands. And the Russian military is expanding. We're now hearing reports that there is a possible another wave of Russian mobilizations that could be planned. It would not surprise me if the intent of the Russian Federation is to expand its ground forces upwards to 2 million personnel. Could the Russians expand its military to 2 million personnel? Absolutely. It's done it in the past. And not that long ago. In terms of history, I mean, there's 145 million people living in the Russian Federation. To say they don't have that capability to expand to 2 million fighting individuals in their ground forces, I think you're fooling yourself. And we do know that the production capacity in the Russian Federation is increasing dramatically. What the Russians were producing in 1 year back in 2021, 2022, they're doing that now in 1 month. And it's going to continue to grow and expand. And then what? It's very clear from statements made by the Kremlin that the Russians are preparing for an extended period of conflict. And I think at this point, as the conflict escalates, as we see, if we see these F-16s, if we see ATACMS being deployed to Ukraine, it is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy for the Russians. And then what will be the Russian response? At a certain point, the Russians are going to come to believe that a Ukrainian state is no longer viable. And they are going to take action to eliminate that viability of the Ukrainian state. It's going to happen. So that's where we sit for today. We will continue our coverage. Thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. As always, have a good day.